All right, let's go ahead and get started. Once more, my name is Radina Valova. I am Vice President of IREC's regulatory program and very excited to be the MC for today's presentation by IREC subject matter experts from the law firm Shute, Mahaly, and Weinberger, which represents IREC in regulatory proceedings. Laura Beaton is a partner with SMW, and Peter Damrosch, who's an attorney with SMW, and both have deep expertise on group studies, and we're very appreciative of their development of the paper that is the subject of today's webinar, as well as for their time presenting today. A little bit about IREC before we move on to the substance of the discussion. IREC is a national nonprofit organization focused on building the foundation for the rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. And we do this through 3 programs. One is a clean energy workforce development program that looks at the clean energy workforce holistically, all the way from K through 12 education through higher ed, and accreditation programs for clean energy jobs. We have a local initiatives program, which is involved with running the SolSmart Clean Energy Designation Program, as well as developing community-based microgrids for resilience in Puerto Rico. And we have the regulatory program through which IREC intervenes as a public interest stakeholder in regulatory proceedings related to integrating renewables on the grid, with issues including interconnection, the subject of today's presentation, as well as hosting capacity analysis and integrated grid planning. And for today, we're going to begin with a background on what are group studies. We'll then go into the methodology and findings for the paper that we published in October that goes into much more detail beyond today's presentation on the subject of group studies. We'll look at some of the key design considerations that we identified through that paper, and also talk about some additional measures beyond group studies that states can use to address interconnection challenges. Group studies or cluster studies are one solution to constrained queues, to lengthy timelines, high grid upgrade costs, but they're not the only solution. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at other solutions as well, and then we'll close with Q&A. We will be taking questions throughout in the chat, so if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we will take them at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Laura and Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Beaton. If you cannot hear me for some reason, drop a message in the chat and we will fix the problem. But right now I'm going to assume you can hear me. So I want to start with just high level, what is a group study? And to understand, what is a group study, we have to look at what the historical study process was under interconnection. I say historical, I mean the kind of the original approach, which, many states still use quite successfully, which is a serial study. And a serial study approach studies projects one at a time as they enter the queue and have a complete application. And the upgrade costs that might be triggered by any one project are paid by the cost causer. And what that means is, projects can continue to interconnect as long as there's capacity, but when a project proposes to interconnect and grid upgrades would be necessary to accommodate that project pays for all of that upgrade cost. Now, that can be unfair because the project may, those ahead in line got the benefit of upgrades that already existed, but consumed capacity. And then this one unlucky project pays for an upgrade that's now necessary. And that upgrade may benefit projects behind it in line. So that is one limitation of serial studies. And another limitation is that if a high number of projects are all trying to interconnect at the same time or in a similar area, this can result in a queue delay if they're studied one by one. So that's where group studies come in. In contrast to singular study one at a time, group studies will study groups of electrically interrelated projects together. And a group will share both the costs of study, so that can make the study more economical. And they can share upgrade costs, which can make it more fair for those that group of projects that now triggered an upgrade to share the costs, and can reduce the costs for individual projects and make it more likely that upgrades can be afforded. So, and one thing I want to note here before we move on is that we're talking about distribution group studies here. You heard Radina say cluster study. The term cluster study is more frequently used at the transmission level, and group study is more frequently, but not exclusively, used at the distribution level. Our paper and our presentation today are about group studies for distribution interconnection. Next slide, please. So I sort of previewed this as I was discussing the previous slide, but what is driving interest in group studies today? More states have adopted or have been revising their group study processes in recent years, and we've noticed some trends that are contributing to that interest. Usually, adopting a group study or trying to improve a group study process comes in response to three different issues. One is what I referenced earlier, just more proposed distributed energy projects. More projects wanting to interconnect at the same time in the same area can lead to queue backlogs and upgrade costs going up. And so a group study is one way to address those issues. Again, that is everything. You know, that is the more proposed DERs leads to the queue delays and can lead to higher upgrade costs. So really these things all go together and are what drive the interest in group studies. And so this is something that frequently states may consider as the distributed energy market matures. Next slide, please. So why did we do this paper? Well, it's because there's an information gap. There's been a growing interest in group studies, but even as we were engaged in regulatory processes considering group studies, there's a relatively little information out there about group studies at the distribution level. And there are not a lot of resources out there to help those considering whether to adopt or develop a group study process. There are very few resources out there to understand what goes into designing a distribution group study. Now, as I mentioned, there are cluster studies at the transmission level, and there's a longer track record of working of cluster study processes at the transmission level. And so that's something you can learn from, but there wasn't any distribution group study specific resources out there. And there are different considerations at the distribution level, including project size, location of project, what upgrade costs are going to look like, and things like that. So the goal of this paper was to provide information specific to group studies. Next slide, please. So to do this paper, we didn't just want to look at the rules and recite to everyone what certain group study processes say. We wanted to actually see how they are working. And so to do that, we selected 6 case study states to try and include states with different reasons for adopting group studies and that take different approaches to group studies and that had different amounts of experience in executing group studies. So these are the states where we went into a deep dive. It's Oregon, California, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Duke's process that is similar in both North and South Carolina. So for example, California has had a group study process for a long time, but it was rarely used up until very recently. And Minnesota, in contrast, just recently allowed Xcel Energy to start using a group study process to address queue backlogs resulting from the Community Solar Garden program. And in Massachusetts, had a very mature DER market where upgrade costs were becoming insurmountable, and the group studies were adopted as an approach to better distributing those costs. So once we identified the states that we wanted to include in our case studies, we reviewed procedures, both the written procedures, but also the docket materials that led to the adoption of the group study. So we can understand the arguments that were being made for and against, and the motivations. And then we also conducted interviews with stakeholders from each state. Now, I want to be honest, full disclosure, we only had one utility from California that was willing to answer some of our questions. A lot of utilities were hesitant to talk to us, but we talked to many developers and some on their experience with group studies. Next slide, please. So we have two key findings from this paper. As I said, group studies are one way of addressing high project volume, queue backlogs, and high upgrade costs, but overall, they're not a cure-all. So we found that the value of a group study depends on the situation on the ground. They can alleviate queue challenges in some circumstances, but their benefits may be more limited where DER penetration is such that there's very little capacity left and very significant upgrades to the distribution system are necessary to accommodate the DER. So, for example, as I mentioned in Minnesota, Excel's group study process has efficiently processed applications. So in that context, the group study process is working. But on the other hand, the outcome of every group study was that the upgrades were still uneconomic for the community solar garden projects. So that's not achieving, if your goal is efficient and cost-effective interconnection, it's not achieving the goal if no project still cannot afford to interconnect. So the group study may not be solving the problem there. And so in Massachusetts, as another example of the limitations of group studies, after a few years of having a group study process there, it became clear that alternative approaches to cost allocation were going to be necessary, again, because of high upgrade costs. And so that led to development of the Capital Investment Project Plan, or the CIP plan, which uses group studies to inform what capital improvements are necessary and to allocate those costs. So this is all to say, one of our findings is that it may be necessary to look beyond group studies alone to include other approaches to, to queue management and cost allocation. And the other thing we learned is that there's no single best approach to group studies. This paper is not going to provide a reader with a roadmap of here's exactly how you do it. That's IREC's model rules for other things. In the model rules, we say this is generally your best way to do interconnection procedures. We don't have the same thing for group studies because it is so context dependent what is going to work or what might work. So the design and the process in each state is going to need to be context specific and tailored to the jurisdiction's specific needs. For example, groups of projects have increased risk of needing review by transmission operators than individual projects would. So this requires coordinating with transmission owners or the ISOs and RTOs to think through ways to minimize unnecessary transmission review. So this is something that on a state-by-state basis may be an issue that needs to be addressed when designing a group study process. Next slide, please. So with all that said, you may say, well, how do I use this paper? Well, here's what the paper provides. And I think it's a really great resource. And I know I'm biased, I wrote it, but I still think it's a great resource. So it provides an exploration of all the components you're going to need for a functional group study process. So, and Peter will be going over these in the second part of the presentation, but generally there are certain components every group study process is going to need. The paper identifies those and walks through different options for addressing the component, like how do you decide which projects are included, or how do you study projects once you've created a group. Then, as I said, we go through a comprehensive discussion of those various approaches, and we're relying on our case studies, what we have learned from those actually working in the states, what they're saying works, what they're saying doesn't work. We're using that to analyze the different successes and drawbacks and to provide again, there are some places where we may say in the paper, this is probably a bad idea to take the approach this way. But we're trying to lay it out so each person or each jurisdiction working on this can use the paper to see what might work best then for them. And then finally, we provide recommendations of additional approaches to dealing with queue issues. So as I said earlier, group studies are not the cure-all. And if your jurisdiction is facing queue backlog or upgrade cost problems, there may be other ways to address that than just a group study. So it's one tool in the toolbox, but a potentially important tool. So that's the background on our paper, how to use it, where we're coming from with this. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Peter to really, again, you'll need to read the paper to get all the details, but Peter's going to dig into all the different components of a group study process and what the different options and considerations should be. So this will be the 1,000-foot level view, and then you can go to the paper for more details. Peter, it's all you.
Thank you, Lara. Yes, so as Lara mentioned, the goal for this next section of the webinar is to introduce the major components of a group study process, to make sure you have an understanding of some of those elements, and to present one or two highlights from our research. The deeper dive and extra levels of detail are in the paper, but also I would encourage you to put questions in the chat. If anything we talk about is pinging interest, we can talk about that in the Q&A at the end. So here on the slide, you can see the sort of 8 major elements that we're going to be talking about that utilities and stakeholders and regulators should be thinking about when approaching the design of a group study process. Next slide, please. So the first step is really a precursor step, which is to figure out what is going on and to determine whether a group study process is helpful and to design that process to address specific challenges. It's important to take a step back and assess the state of the DER market, grid conditions, and the state of the queue. And that helps inform shared understandings about what is working well in the current process, what are the challenges, and what might needs to be changed. And part of why we identify this as a critical step when thinking about group studies is there are a range of tools for addressing queue challenges and grid constraints, and group studies may or may not be the right tool for that job. There are other queue management techniques, for example, requiring evidence of site control if it's not already required, or timeline enforcement that can help move queues along without needing to create a new and quite complex group study process. But even if a group study process is something that your jurisdiction is interested in, this initial assessment is essential for understanding how to design the process to function effectively. And as we suggest in the paper, whether or not you end up adopting a group study process, it's essential to do the basic queue management so that the initial group studies are functioning effectively, as opposed to functioning as a de facto way to clear the queue. Next slide, please. So the first major element in a group study process is figuring out how to form groups of projects. And there are 2 essential components to the question of what projects to group together. One is figuring out how to group projects geographically or in terms of the shared infrastructure and electric relatedness that they have. And the other is thinking about how to group projects over time, which is how do you put groups of projects together when project applicants are submitting applications to interconnect at different periods of time. An interesting part of our research is there is definitely not any one dominant approach to these questions at the distribution level. So for the states that have distribution group study processes, on the question of how and time to group projects, some states follow a fixed schedule of once a year or twice a year, a group study window opens and projects can apply to be studied in that particular class. Other states use more of an as-needed approach, which is identifying triggers or conditions under which a group study is going to be preferable to an individual study, and then moving projects into a group study at that point. And some states even blend the two. So in California, there is a fixed schedule to have a group study every 6 months, but every application presumptively starts as an individual studied project and only gets moved to the group study if, after the utilities review, they determine that that project is going to be electrically related to earlier queued projects. And that last approach has a lot of advantages because it allows you to form groups when they seem necessary, but avoid the extra process and procedure when they're not. There's a lot else that we could go into here, particularly on questions around what is the boundaries of a group in terms of electrical related projects, but for the interest of time, we will save that for the paper or the Q&A. Next slide, please. So second major component, after thinking about what is the process going to look like for grouping projects, is thinking through the timeline. And certainly one of the major drawbacks of a group study process is they tend to be much longer than an individual study on a study-by-study basis. And that is both because the group study is more complex, there are more projects to be studied, more impacts to be evaluated, and potentially more upgrades to plan, but also because the group study process has a number of individual steps and procedures that are often not required for an individual system impact study. These include the initial period to form groups, customer engagement between and before different stages of the study, and potentially restudies that are needed and can be triggered by changes in the composition of the group. So here we have on the slide a few sort of summation of timelines we saw in the procedures, and we didn't want to communicate, the cumulative impact of these timelines can be quite large. For example, in Massachusetts, the procedures allow up to 5 to 6 months before the utilities even start the study. That's just in the kind of initial engagement and formation stage. And so it's critical to keep in mind ways to make sure the process is moving at a speed that it should, and also save steps and time in the process by designing steps that can be done concurrently and doing them in that fashion. And we go into those in more depth in the paper, but we would mention that we discussed, for example, having timeline accountability or enforcement mechanisms. And that is something that FERC has been embracing in its recent Order 2023 on interconnection at the transmission level. They've really been focusing on timeline accountability, and that is certainly something that should be happening at the distribution system as well for all interconnection processes, but particularly for group study procedures. Next slide, please. So after you think about group formation and the timelines, the next big component is what does the study itself look like? And in our 5 case study states, there are some differences in terms of how the group study proceeds. In certain ways, it's very similar to an individual project's system impact study. It's designed to identify potentially adverse system impacts, and if those exist, then identify upgrades that are needed to accommodate those impacts. Some of the differences with an individual study is group study procedures more often, though not always, define the study to proceed in phases, and that can allow developers to get information about how the likelihood of upgrades, whether this is going to become a very expensive interconnection process or not. And then as one component we'll talk about more in the next sections, because the composition of the group can change, there may be a need to do restudies if certain projects drop out or request modifications. There's one particular aspect that we want to highlight in the next slide that Lara already touched on. If you can move to the next slide. And so, as Lara mentioned, one of the biggest takeaways from anyone looking at distribution group studies is relative to individual studies, a group of projects is much more likely to trigger some level of transmission review. So in Massachusetts, for example, every single one of Massachusetts groups in recent years has needed to go through an affected system operator study for ISO New England's procedures, which is very different than in individual projects, because individual projects often don't appear as a very large blip on the transmission system radar, but groups of projects do, because they are in aggregate a much larger potential impact, and therefore is something that other utilities or ISOs and RTOs are more likely going to need to study. And because of that, when you're thinking about distribution group studies, you're often thinking about two levels of study: the study of impacts on the distribution system and potentially impacts on the transmission system. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the transmission system cluster studies in many areas of the country have been proceeding very slowly, causing extremely high costs. And there's a need to think very carefully about how to coordinate between a distribution group study and a transmission impact study to reduce the need for unnecessary transmission impact studies or provide lower level or simpler studies. And it is frankly a consideration to be thought through when deciding whether to adopt a group study process at all, which is understanding what are going to be implications if distribution projects are being sent for more and more transmission level review. If you can move to the next slide, please. So the next component that we go into in the paper are thinking through the potential impacts of projects initially joining a group, going partway through the process, and then withdrawing. As one of the themes from our research is project withdrawals have downsides. So in certain instances, project withdrawals from a group, the utility may need to do a restudy of the remaining projects to determine whether the results of the initial studies still hold and whether they still need the same level of upgrades. But on the flip side, not all project withdrawals are necessarily bad. Sometimes the group as a whole has a particularly high level of upgrade costs, and one or two projects dropping out can reduce the need for certain upgrades and be saving remaining projects money. And then a final theme we heard is, particularly with long group study processes, some level of project withdrawals may be inevitable. There are elements of the development process that arise at various points, from discovering that a new permit is required to some other environmental impact that can change a project's viability and cause it to withdraw. There's been a lot of attention on this at the transmission level, and for those of you who've been following this issue, FERC in Order 2023 adopted new financial commitments that projects have to shell out at different stages of the cluster study process, and financial penalties for withdrawing later in the process that are meant to deter speculative projects from joining clusters and leaving earlier rather than later if they need to. I think an interesting finding from our research is those kinds of financial commitments and withdrawal penalties are by no means universal at the distribution level. So among our 5 or 6 case study states, California, Massachusetts, and Excel in Minnesota do not have heavy withdrawal penalties. And we did not hear from the interviews we conducted that people were particularly clamoring for them either at the moment. That could change if there's a rush of speculative projects. But I think it's important to think carefully about, are these kinds of financial commitments and penalties necessary? Are they necessary at the distribution level in general, and in particular in the context where your process is operating? And avoid what can sometimes be a temptation to just copy transmission procedures and try to apply them in the distribution realm, because that may not be necessary. Next slide, please. A related issue is not projects dropping out entirely, but modifying their project in some way. And the concerns are similar in some respects. There's a concern that if you allow group members to change their projects midstream, that could require the utility to need to restudy the entire group, which in turn could slow down other projects. And that's a very real concern. At the same time, it's clear that certain project modifications have a very low likelihood of triggering any need for a restudy. And again, in certain ways could be beneficial. So for example, when a group as a whole is having high upgrade costs that are related in some way to the export capacity of the projects in the group, individual projects lowering their aggregate size or their export capacity can save upgrade costs that might otherwise be needed and lead to a less expensive interconnection process and a quicker one if certain upgrades aren't needed. So there's a balancing act between accommodating project modifications that may be beneficial and not allowing ones that are detrimental to other members of the group or the group as a whole. And one of our main findings is that a number of group study procedures really have not thought through the project modification process in enough detail. In some states, it's not clear what project modifications are allowed as of right, if any. In others, such as Massachusetts, there is a particularly cumbersome process where any project applicant that wants to propose a change needs to get consensus from every other member of the group, and there aren't good systems in place for doing that. Some states, though, have included thoughtful design considerations. So California, for example, has a defined list of allowed modifications, including certain amounts of project downsizing. And there are ways that we've seen that some states are doing this better, but also this is one of those areas. And part of what makes this exciting is there aren't clear best practices, and there's need for good thought and experimentation for anyone involved in these procedures. Next slide, please. So next major element, as Lara introduced, is potential benefit of group studies is the ability to share upgrade costs across group members and also share study costs, which is the cost of actually paying for utility engineering time or consultant time to conduct the system impact studies. And one of the things we heard from our research is that in general, project applicants are quite happy with the study costs in group studies because sharing a single study across many applicants does lower the cost per applicant. Group upgrade costs, on the other hand, there can still be some benefit in sharing upgrade costs, but there are also a number of problems. So one is if groups are defined quite large in terms of their sort of geographic reach or the substations and sections of the grid that they cover. There are projects that may be only in actuality minimally responsible for an upgrade at some other part of the system that are being required to pay for those upgrades, where their interconnection might be delayed if those upgrades are not built. One developer described this as the problem of a death by 1,000 cuts. So there is some need to think about how to allocate costs and whether to require every project to pay, even if they're only minimally responsible for a specific upgrade. And then as Lara previewed, there are situations where upgrades are uneconomical even for an entire group to share. And that is what, for example, developers in Minnesota have found, where every developer in every project, in every group, have had to back out because of uneconomic upgrades, which leads into the final section of the paper, where we'll discuss some other alternative approaches. Next slide, please. And a final piece is once there's a group study process and vision in place, you do need to think through how do we transition from the traditional serial study process to a group study process, or a process that has both a traditional serial study process and then a group study process as needed, as in California. The paper goes into some recommendations on considerations to think through for that transition, since there are a lot of projects that have proposed to interconnect under legacy procedures, and you need to think about how to move them over to a new procedure or finish them under the existing serial study process. Next slide, please. So, as Lara mentioned, certainly I think one of the major themes of our research is in looking at why states have been adopting group studies or where the growing interest in them is coming from. There's often a theme that we hear that there's a major interconnection problem or major backlogs or high upgrade costs, and a group study process will solve those. And they're really often pitched as part of queue reform and an essential component of queue reform that will fix a whole host of interconnection related challenges. And we wanted to offer a cautionary note on the what one can expect are going to be the benefits of a group study process. A functioning group study process may be very beneficial, but by itself, it's not necessarily up to the task of handling a whole range of interconnection challenges. So the paper discusses several additional interconnection reforms that states and utilities and other stakeholders should consider either as alternatives to a group study process if that initial step 0 assessment shows that a group study process may not be needed at this time, or as complementary reforms that will help get the most out of an eventual group study process. So we'll touch on these briefly and how they relate to group studies in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the first, and certainly one of the most critical, is to think about and engage in long-term proactive planning to identify constraints on the distribution system, plan for upgrades, and construct them in advance of major queue crises developing. And this general rubric that IREC and others have been developing and advocating for a number of years is generally called integrated distribution system planning. And the essential basic components of integrated distribution system planning are forecasting, so to understand going forward what are the likely quantities and locations of distributed energy generation resources that want to connect to the grid, but also what are the electrification needs and load needs, and developing a distribution system plan and upgrade process to accommodate both the load and the generation needs going forward. And as part of IDP, as it's often called, integrated distribution planning, one essential feature is to think about who pays for proactive upgrades. So, often in the interconnection process, it's as Laura mentioned, the last project that tries to interconnect pays for an entire upgrade. But on the load side, there's often more ratepayers are sharing costs of upgrades that are benefiting the system as a whole. And we want to mention this in the group study process in particular because of an interesting experience that Massachusetts has been having. So as Laura referenced at the outset, the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities and Eversource and National Grid identified areas of the grid that were at full penetration and major upgrades would be needed. And rather than relying upon group studies alone to address those constraints, the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities directed Eversource and National Grid to develop capital investment plans to figure out what upgrades would be needed to accommodate likely DER interconnection. And that resulted in a planning process that in Massachusetts was tied to the group studies that the utilities were conducting. So Eversource and National Grid conducted a group study for different regions of Massachusetts, identified a set of upgrades that would be needed to accommodate those projects. But frequently those upgrades would also have additional capacity beyond what those group members need. And then a critical innovation in the Massachusetts, it's called the Provisional System Planning Program, is how the cost of those upgrades are proposed to be allocated. So rather than having just an individual project pay for the whole upgrade, or even just having the group pay for the upgrade, under the Massachusetts proposals that the utilities have been developing, the upgrade costs are split among 3 categories: current group members, future developers who are going to interconnect in that area, and ratepayers. And the way they're divided up is there's some methodologies for trying to attribute the benefits to each of those groups and divide the overall upgrade costs among them. And it leads to a single per kilowatt fee in order to interconnect in that area, with that fee being necessary to cover the cost of the upgrades. And current developers in the group will pay those fees, as well as future developers that interconnect in that area and take advantage of the capacity that has been built. And then a portion of the cost is also proposed to be funded by ratepayers, reflecting the fact that there are benefits to ratepayers from increased reliability and increased capacity to help with electrification. So far, my understanding is that Massachusetts, the utilities have submitted a series of these capital investment plans for different parts of the distribution system. The Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities approved one last December, and I believe the rest are still pending before the department at this time. But it's an example of, it's not full integrated distribution system planning because it's not entirely forecasting all electrification needs, all DER needs, but it is doing some of that, and it's developing these new cost allocation methods that may make upgrades economical by recognizing the benefits that apply not only to current developers, but future developers and ratepayers. There's a lot to think through there, but is something that is an important next step that many states certainly are going to be considering and experimenting with in the years to come as distribution capacity constraints keep increasing. Next slide, please. So a second companion effort to group studies is thinking about ways to improve the visibility into grid capacity that people outside of the utility have. Radina mentioned at the outset, IREC has been very involved in the development of hosting capacity analyses, which are planning analyses to evaluate what the current capacity on the grid is for interconnecting either new distribution or new new generation or new load. And there's wonderful resources that we reference in our paper and that IREC has put together on how to develop and maintain critically robust hosting capacity analyses. And then there are other tools, including pre-application reports. These are ways to ping the utility about a specific location on the grid where one might want to interconnect to learn more about capacity constraints at that particular point. And these tools are pretty essential for ensuring that project developers are not flying blind, but instead are applying to specific areas on the grid where they believe there's likely to be capacity. And that can help the entire group study process move much more quickly if major upgrades are not needed, which can slow down the process significantly. Next slide, please. A companion to a hosting capacity analysis, which says here's what the capacity on the grid is improving visibility into other projects that are trying to connect to the grid but haven't yet. And a number of states, New York is one, California is another, have public queues where the utilities post and update regularly the list of projects that have applied to interconnect, noting project size and where they're trying to interconnect. And that information is very important for project developers to understand how many other projects are trying to cram into the same area and the likelihood of upgrade costs and delays. We bring this up in the context of group studies in particular, because one of the things we heard is that, especially in states that have a fixed window, like every 6 month or every year group study window, there's often very little visibility into what other projects are trying to enter that group study during that window. So what projects have applied over the last year is not known to anyone until the groups are formed. And that can really lead developers to make misinformed choices when they're evaluating different projects. And should we approve project A or project B? They don't know which projects are, which areas of the queue are likely to be experiencing high demand and delays. So having a public queue is essential and good practice for serial study states or group study states, but certainly in group studies are essential as well. Next slide, please. A second very exciting area is continuing to think through more how to design energy procurement programs and interconnection processes. So many states and utilities have procurement programs for specific kinds of resources like community solar projects or energy storage projects, or just overall capacity needs. And the paper walks through, there's some, definitely some considerations you want to think about when designing a procurement process to make sure you don't flood the queue with projects by, for example, requiring or inappropriately incentivizing projects to all locate in one particular area that might not be able to handle the capacity, resulting in huge queue delays. But there's also some interesting work being done, for example, by Duke in North Carolina on thinking about how to integrate procurement awards with the interconnection timeline better in order to choose which projects are going to receive a procurement award with a more informed understanding of interconnection costs. So that can happen, for example, if a group study is broken up into phases, doing the award for procurement program after phase 1 of a study. And there's also some other ways that utilities are thinking through how to be smart about aligning interconnection and procurement processes that we recommend thinking through more in that section of the paper. And then I believe the last slide, please. Finally, it's just something we want to mention. Group studies are complicated. They are novel. They are an area of emerging experimentation and research. And if you're going to introduce a group study process, it is vital that you don't just enact procedures and leave them on the shelf to get stale over time quickly. Instead, we strongly encourage public utility commissions to convene standing working groups that are specifically tasked with reviewing interconnection challenges, identifying problems, developing solutions, and revising process procedures and manuals regularly. Again, this is good practice for any state approaching interconnection reform, but is essential for group studies where there are a large number of novel steps that we need to learn from and understand how they're working and evolve, rather than what it's often been the case, which is the habit to enact a procedure and wait a decade or 15 years to revisit it. Next slide, please. So that is the end of the presentation portion. We are very grateful that everyone was able to attend today. We have 10 or 12 minutes for questions and answers and discussion, and strongly encourage you as well to check out the paper when you have an opportunity. I, like Laura, echo her bias. We think there's a lot of interesting material in there. And again, part of it is interesting because there are things we know and have an understanding of, and there are a lot of just emerging areas to think through. So it's somewhere where your input and intellectual development is much needed.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I forgot to do this during my presentation as I intended. I wanted to specifically thank those folks, the developers, the regulators, the utility who spoke to us in development of this paper. We truly were not able to create this paper without that participation, and I wanted to call out that acknowledgement and thanks. I think we did have a few questions, and Radina or Mari, are you going to ask us the questions that you have?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter and Laura. Sorry, it took me a minute to get off of my double mute over here. Yeah, so we have a few questions, but we'd love to hear. Okay, actually, I just saw a question that came in because we haven't gotten a ton from you all in the audience. So please share your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can. I'm going to start with one because we've been trying to compile a few that would be, we think, helpful for everyone to hear what you all would say as the experts on this. So I'm going to start with one that we had, and then I'll move to the audience questions. So is this a case where something is better than nothing? Like, people always say the perfect being the enemy of the good here. Is it best to just have a group study process regardless of whether it's designed perfectly right, whether it fixes all of your issues, rather than, just not having, not allowing customers to have that option? So I want to start there just as a very basic question.
Sure. Well, I would say if you're going to do one, get it right. And of course, that's easy for me to say because everyone, I think, when they develop a process, tries to get it right. And it's only in practice that we encounter pitfalls, mistakes, the unintended consequences. So I would say that if after analyzing the situation in your state and review our paper, see what circumstances warrant a group study. If you say, I think the problems we have could be addressed at least in part by a group study process, there's your step one. Okay, probably reasonable to pursue a group study. Because I'm not saying group studies are the right fix for every state. So I don't want to say just go adopt one and that's a great idea. Then once you've decided you're going to do that, that is when you use the paper, use experiences in other states, and try and get it right. Try and come up with a process that fits the problems you're trying to address, and learn from mistakes. Learn where other states have had issues, and finally, look beyond the group study process, because the problems you're trying to address may not only be fixed by a group study. There may be a suite of reforms that will help manage queue issues or deal with upgrade cost issues. And then I was going to say, I saw, I was going to just hop, I see there's questions in the chat, and I want to give attention to those. I see one question that says, what information would be provided in a pre-application report that may not be provided on a utility's hosting capacity map? Without having, and I will just be honest, without having my list, the list of the pre-application report topics sitting in front of me right now, I couldn't give you a point-by-point comparison, but the pre-application reports tend to provide more detailed information specific to a project, while the hosting capacity map should, provide the higher level information. Peter, I want to give you an opportunity to just shake your head if you don't have anything to add to that.
No, just also one thing application reports sometimes include is any prior studies the utility has done in that area. So that can be useful, for example, in seeing what upgrades the utility has previously said are going to be necessary in a previous system impact study, even though those upgrades didn't end up being built. So you can get more, as Laura was saying, detailed information than sometimes just the basic number of under current conditions, how much capacity is available here at this point on the grid.
And I wanted to recognize Mary's question about dealing with the interplay of DG group studies and the transmission cluster projects and reserving capacity. And it's going to be unsatisfying, but I'm going to say I can't answer that today because I have worked on issues about reserving capacity at the distribution level, but I personally have not dug into the issue of reserving capacity for DG projects in the transmission cluster. I think that's an interesting point to bring up, though, because as we see more interplay between distribution groups and transmission studies, we're going to have to think through what are solutions here and how do we not end up with all of the distribution groups ending up in transmission studies. And then you're not solving for the speeding up the queue issue because you're adding a whole new layer of study there. So unsatisfying answer, don't have a clear answer there, but I think that is one of the issues that needs to be addressed as we have the increasing use of group studies that are going to have transmission impacts.
Great, thanks, Laura. And if you want to add, go ahead.
Oh, Peter may have had something to add there. Go for it.
No, something that the paper goes into, but we didn't discuss here, is this can look different depending on if you're in a for example, vertically integrated state where, or just in a state where the same entity is responsible for distribution studies and transmission studies, as opposed to, for example, a state where transmission studies are done by a state utility or distribution studies are done by a state utility and transmission by a regional transmission operator. There are some different ways to handle these impacts depending on the particular institutions that you're involved with. And the paper describes some of those a little bit more in depth.
Great, thanks, Peter. And just wanted to note, we threw a survey in the chat. We'd love to get your feedback. Just a really short event survey. You can get the link right there. It's a type form survey. So if you could please take a second to fill that out, that would be great. And if you have any other questions, please throw them in. We have a few more minutes. And so since we've only gotten a couple of questions, I'm going to go back to our list. And this is for either of you, although Peter, maybe you might be able to answer this one. Is there any state that has adopted group studies that's already getting it right? which states would you point to as best practices for others?
I don't know that among the 5 states we studied, there was acknowledgement that everyone had gotten everything right. There were definitely elements that seemed strong and promising. So a couple we've mentioned, California's process of defaulting to individual studies, but moving to group studies as needed is a good way to sort of not unnecessarily put projects into a group study process if they're not needed. That's certainly one consideration to think through. Massachusetts, as we discussed with the capital investment plans and cost allocation, it's a very good approach. Massachusetts also has a timeline enforcement mechanism for its group studies. So individual elements with a lot to be learned. But in most of our interviews, there were different features of the experience on the ground that were pretty clear. It still needed to be improved, long timelines for studies, and other issues that still need to be thought through.
Yeah, and I'll jump in with some of my favorite examples from different states. With California, I like the opportunity for customer results meetings and as Peter discussed, the opportunity to modify projects and even downsize a certain amount to try and avoid significant upgrade costs. I think that flexibility is a good thing to bake into your group study processes. Duke's process in North and South Carolina really clearly lays out the iterations of the group study and how you're going to have to go through some phases and through some opportunities for projects to withdraw, and also has and I will say I can't attest to whether the utility is always providing the most useful information at the meetings, but Duke's process does provide for a number of moments for the members of the group and the utility to interact. And I think that's really important in these processes, is to make sure that the group study is not this black box that the group goes into and then results are spit out and that's it. The communications are really key. The communication between the developers and the utility is really key to, to use an overused term, to right size the group and to figure out and to right size the projects.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more quick one, and it kind of relates to what you all were, kind of where you moved with that a little bit, is, how do you balance between the need for some flexibility for customers, and the need for them to have firm commitments so that the group doesn't change too much in terms of the projects that join and the design of those projects? If you need to restate that, was all over. But.
No, that's that's a great question, and that's one where my thinking actually changed during the development of the paper, and I like that you brought it up. So I went into this paper thinking that the best outcome would be to keep projects in a group, that you wanted to penalize projects for withdrawing. You wanted to have high deposits that would be lost because you didn't want projects to leave the group because you would need to restudy, and that's inefficient. That was my thinking going in, and I think I was wrong. I think that based on our interviews and seeing how things work on the ground, it's actually more important to have off-ramps, to not make it cost prohibitive or a huge loss for a group to leave, because you want to encourage projects to leave the group if it is good for the group. If one project leaving is going to make the upgrade costs economic, then you don't want projects to stay in gritting their teeth playing a game of chicken because they've already invested so much. And I know that there's a lot invested up until that point, but providing those opportunities to restudy and to allow the group to iterate for projects that aren't going to work to leave, and to give projects the opportunity to modify themselves and allow some modifications, even if it does result in a restudy. I think those provisions are a good way to balance and to ensure the group study process turns out well.
Great. Thank you both again for presenting, and thanks to Radina for emceeing the first part. And I just want to thank everyone who's still on. I know we've run a little bit over. And thank you so much for participating, and feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Thank you again. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and close the webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.